Secrets buried deep, justice runs deeper. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Warm Tales. I am Khadi. How has your day been? I do hope it's been a kind one. Let me know where you're joining us from tonight. I love hearing from all corners of the world. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Shop with the Quiet Backroom. St. Mary Mead had a way of presenting its disturbances as if they were parcels delivered to the wrong house, wrapped neatly, labeled politely, and somehow more alarming for the care that had been taken. On that Tuesday morning, the village looked exactly as it ought. The church clock kept its steady mind. A thin March sun held itself above the hedges with a watery patience. The daffodils by the lych gate had begun to show their yellow heads, not with any theatrical flourish, but as a good housekeeper might bring out the spring tablecloth, without remark, simply because it was time. Miss Marple went out after breakfast with her shopping basket on her arm. Not a large basket. She did not believe in carrying what one could fetch tomorrow, but it was lined with a clean cloth, and it contained a short list written in pencil, each item placed on its own line, as if it deserved the dignity of space. She walked first to the greengrocer for carrots and a bunch of parsley, stopping briefly to examine the parsley in the way she examined most things, with quiet attention, as though the truth of it might be discovered by looking long enough. Outside the post office, there was a small knot of people. Not a crowd, exactly. A crowd would have implied excitement. This was more like a cluster of birds that had paused on a wire, all facing in the same direction. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, stood in the doorway with an expression of dutiful containment, as if she were holding back a draft. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, and then, since she could not hold it in any longer, "Have you heard about Miss Cray?" Miss Marple did not alter her pace. She came up the step, put her basket down carefully, and took off her glove, because one never handled coins with a glove if one could help it. "Miss Edith Cray," she said pleasantly. "No, I don't think I have." Mrs. Price leaned forward a little. Her voice lowered, not because the subject was confidential. St. Mary Mead did not keep confidences so much as it rotated them, but because a lowered voice made the speaker feel more responsible. "She isn't in her shop," Mrs. Price said, "and she isn't at home. Mr. Grafton went round, to collect the week's takings for the parish jumble sale tickets, and he found the door at the side unlocked. That back door she always bolts." Miss Marple looked at the display of birthday cards in the window. They had been arranged in a precise fan. Some displayed small baskets of flowers. Others showed improbable kittens with bright eyes. There was a card with a seaside scene and the words "wishing you sunshine." She observed that it had been placed very slightly out of line with the rest, and she moved it just a fraction so that the edges were even. "Perhaps she stepped out," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Price gave a short sound that might have been a laugh if it had not contained reproach. "Stepped out with the back office laid open," she said, "and with her accounts book on the desk. She's that careful, Miss Marple. She's careful in her bones." Careful in her bones. It was a curious phrase, and a true one. Edith Cray had run Cray Stationers and General Services for nearly 20 years. The front of the shop sold writing paper, envelopes, stamps, pencils, notebooks, a small rack of novels that people borrowed and sometimes returned, and a little glass jar of boiled sweets for children with pennies. The back room, reached by a narrow passage, held what Miss Cray was really known for, her work as a bookkeeper. She kept accounts for half the village. She did it with the same exactness with which she stacked her envelopes. You could bring her a shoebox of receipts, and she would turn it into a ledger that looked as calm as a hymn book. Mrs. Price continued, eager now. "They say it's all in order," she said. "That's what's so strange." Her pens put away, the blotters in its place, her cups washed and upside down on the rack. Not a crumb, not a thing disturbed. Miss Marple bought her stamps, placed them in her purse, and snapped the clasp shut with a small, decisive click. "All in order," she repeated. "Yes," said Mrs. Price, and then she glanced at the people outside, as if checking that they were listening. And that's not natural when somebody's taken suddenly ill or had a fright. You'd think there'd be something. A chair knocked, a drawer pulled out. But no, it's as if she finished her day. And yet it was only Monday afternoon, said Miss Marple gently, because she had noticed one thing already. When Mrs. Price spoke of Monday afternoon, her eyes slid involuntarily to the wall calendar behind the counter, as if time itself were part of the accusation. Mrs. Price's mouth tightened. 4:30, she said. That's when Mrs. Tuck saw her closing up, so she says. And now it's Tuesday morning, and nothing. Miss Marple lifted her basket again. She did not hurry. In the face of other people's urgency, her steadiness could look like indifference, but it was not. It was simply the habit of a life in which one had learned that haste often caused one to miss the thing one needed most. She walked down the lane toward Cray's shop. There were 2 policemen already there. Not from the village. St. Mary Mead did not possess its own police force in any grand sense, but from the nearest small station. The village constable, Constable Pritchard, looked young enough to have been issued his uniform with the expectation that he would grow into it. Sergeant Dobbs stood at the shop entrance with his notebook. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said politely, and then, because the village expected politeness even in emergencies, he added, "Sorry to block your way." Miss Marple's eyes traveled past him into the shop. Everything visible from the doorway was in its usual place. The rack of cards, the pencils in their jars, the stack of brown paper tied with string. It looked, in fact, as though someone had made a special effort to ensure it looked like that. "What a comfort it is," Miss Marple said mildly, "when a person keeps things so tidy." Sergeant Dobbs looked surprised. He had expected questions or exclamations. He had not expected a remark that sounded like something said over teacup. "Yes," he said cautiously, "it is tidy." Miss Marple's gaze went not to the display, but to the floor. "There's no grit," she observed, still mildly. "Grit? Yes," said Miss Marple. "It has been dry for 3 days. Everyone brings a little in on their shoes. Even if you sweep, one usually sees something in the corners. A little line, perhaps." Constable Pritchard glanced down, as if embarrassed to have overlooked it. The shop floor was bare and clean to a degree that suggested not ordinary sweeping, but something more deliberate. Sergeant Dobbs scribbled a note. "In her back room?" Miss Marple asked, as if asking after someone's kitchen. Sergeant Dobbs hesitated. He looked at her, and one could see the calculation. Miss Marple was, after all, an elderly lady who had been known to have opinions on matters she had no business in, and yet she was also an elderly lady whom no one could quite bring themselves to exclude. To exclude her would have been like locking the church. "It's being examined," he said, "but we're not letting too many people through." Miss Marple nodded, as if that were perfectly sensible. "It's odd," she said, with the faintest tilt of her head. "When a person is very orderly, their disorder is, what shall I say, more expressive, like a jam jar with a wrong label." Sergeant Dobbs looked at her more directly. "Ad jam jar." Miss Marple smiled at him. "One expects strawberry," she said, "and one finds gooseberry. It is not dreadful, of course, but makes one pause." Then she moved aside so that a man carrying a small camera could pass, and she continued on her way home. She made 2 observations that sounded like nothing. The first had been about grit. The second was made as she passed the side gate leading to Miss Cray's little cottage behind the shop. The gate hung slightly ajar, and the latch, Miss Cray's latch, had been fastened not in its accustomed way, but with a simple twist of wire, the sort of thing one did when one had no key. Miss Marple paused, not for long, just long enough to see the wire, to see how fresh and bright it was, and to smell faintly the sharp scent of metal where someone's fingers had rubbed it. Then she went home, as people did, and made herself a cup of tea. And all the while, without any show of it, her mind held the picture of that spotless floor and that improvised wire. Order, she thought, could be a comfort, or it could be a disguise. Chapter 2. The Ledger That Waited. Later that afternoon, the news changed shape, again, as it did in villages where facts were like dough and each pair of hands made it something slightly different. Miss Marple was in her kitchen, trimming the ends from the carrots. She did not waste much. She had been brought up to believe that waste was a moral failing rather than a mere habit. The radio was off. Miss Marple preferred her thoughts to other people's voices. A knock came at the back door. Not the sharp, impatient knock of a tradesman, but the particular knock of someone who felt entitled to enter because they were accustomed to being welcomed. Miss Marple wiped her hands, went to the door, and found Mrs. Bantry on the step, her cheeks pink from brisk walking and her eyes bright with the sort of excitement that came from having something urgent to share. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said at once, "have you heard? They found her." Miss Marple stepped back to let her in. "Do sit down," she said. "You must be chilly. I have the kettle on." Mrs. Bantry did not sit down immediately. She stood near the table, as though sitting would diminish the importance of what she had come to say. "Not found as in, well," she said, searching for the right tone. "Not found as in dead, but found as in goodness knows what. On Mr. Harrow's land, down by the old chalk pit." Miss Marple took out her best china, not because this was a celebration, but because good china steadied the nerves. It reminded one that life had a pattern, even when the day did not. "The old chalk pit," she repeated. "Yes," said Mrs. Bantry. "You know that little keeper's hut? The one no one uses? They found her there. Sergeant Dobbs says she was in a dreadful state, cold and confused. She's at the doctor's now." Miss Marple poured boiling water over the tea leaves and placed the lid on the pot. "Was she locked in?" she asked, as though asking whether the hens had been shut up. Mrs. Bantry threw up her hands in helpless frustration. "That's just it," she said. "No one knows. There's talk of it being an accident. Some say she went down there herself, had a turn, and couldn't get out. Others say all sorts. But it doesn't make sense, Jane. Miss Cray doesn't go wandering about chalk pits." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "She does not." Mrs. Bantry sat down at last. "And what's more," she said, lowering her voice, "they say her shop is exactly as it was, as if she'd gone to bed and simply not woken up in the morning." Miss Marple put milk in the cups, then tea, then handed one to Mrs. Bantry. "Sugar?" she asked. Mrs. Bantry accepted 2 lumps with the air of someone who deserved them for having made the effort to come. "She's such a reserved woman," Mrs. Bantry said, stirring. "Not unfriendly, you know, but private. She never spoke of her affairs. That's why this feels so indecent, like opening someone's drawer." Miss Marple sat down opposite her, cup in hand, eyes on the steam as it rose. She had her private drawer, Miss Marple said, and it was not, at first hearing, a significant remark. The one at the top right by the blotter. She kept her stamps there, and her little tin of paper clips. She once told me she liked them all in one place, because then she never had a hunt. Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Yes, I remember," she said. "It was always locked." Miss Marple nodded, as if confirming that drawers, like people, had their habits. "And did Sergeant Dobbs mention," Miss Marple asked, "whether that drawer was locked?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "I don't know," she said. "But Jane, you don't think." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "One of the first things a person does when they leave in a hurry," she said, "is forget the small, accustomed action. The bolt on the back door, for example, or the key in the top drawer. The habits are what slip." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "You mean," she said slowly, "if everything was in order, too much in order, then it wasn't Miss Cray's order." Miss Marple did not answer directly. She took a sip of tea, and her eyes moved, as her eyes often did, to the small notepad beside the telephone. It held her grocery list. It held, too, a set of household accounts written in a steady hand. "It is remarkable," Miss Marple said, "how different 2 neat desks can be. A neat desk that belongs to a person and a neat desk that has been made neat for other reasons." Mrs. Bantry shivered, though the kitchen was warm. "They'll ask questions," she said. "They must." But poor Miss Cray, poor woman. And poor Sergeant Dobbs, too. He'll have to go through all those papers. It must be like trying to understand a garden by looking at dried leaves. Miss Marple set down her cup. Paper tells its own story, she said softly, if one has read enough of it. There was a pause. The kettle clicked faintly as it cooled. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. Jane, she said, you have read more letters than anyone. You always know when something is off. Like that time, with Colonel Prothero's nephew and those dreadful postcards from abroad. Miss Marple's mouth tightened briefly, not in pleasure at being praised, but in remembrance. Sometimes, she said, a letter is written to be read, and sometimes it is written to be kept. Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. I don't quite. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, it doesn't matter, she said. Have another slice of seed cake. I made it yesterday. But when Mrs. Bantry left, and Miss Marple returned to her carrots, she found she was thinking, not of chalk pits, but of drawers. Of the small private drawer in the top right, of a habit forgotten or imitated, and of the way fear, when it writes, often uses an excessive politeness, as if manners could keep danger out. Chapter 3. Thursday Tea in a Tidy Mind. By Thursday afternoon, St. Mary Mead had settled into the rhythm it always settled into, the rhythm of knowing and not knowing. Miss Cray remained at the doctor's house. Dr. Haydock had said, with the bluntness of a man who disliked being forced into delicacy, that she was out of sorts, chilled through, and badly shaken. He had also said, in a lower voice to Mrs. Bantry, that there was something about her confusion that did not sit comfortably with simple exposure and fright. Miss Marple did not go to see Miss Cray. She did not believe in descending upon the unwell like a committee. One did not need to look at a person in bed to know they were suffering. And one did not need to ask questions in order to hear answers in a village like St. Mary Mead. On Thursday afternoons, as reliably as the milkman, Miss Weatherby came to tea. Miss Weatherby was the sort of neighbor who arrived with a hat that had seen better seasons and a small parcel of conversation tied up in string. She brought the week's events and placed them on Miss Marple's table as if they were scones. My dear, Miss Weatherby said, removing her gloves finger by finger, such goings-on. Edith Cray, well, I never. And do you know what I heard? That Sergeant Dobbs found her ledger open on the wrong page. Miss Marple set down the teapot. Did he? She asked. Yes, said Miss Weatherby triumphantly. It was open to April when it ought to have been March. Not that I understand those things. I can't bear figures. But Edith loved them. Miss Marple gave a small approving sound. Yes, she said. She did. Figures are honest, if one writes them honestly. Miss Weatherby accepted her cup, added milk, and began to talk in earnest. They say Mr. Harrow has been dreadfully upset, she said. You know, Rupert Harrow, such a pillar. He came at once when the chalk pit hut was searched, and he was the one who suggested it might be an accident. He said Edith was always walking, though I never saw her walking anywhere except to the shop and back. Miss Marple sliced the seed cake. The knife went through with a clean, steady pressure. Mr. Harrow is very kind, Miss Marple said politely. Miss Weatherby leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Kind, she said, and there was a faint stress on the word, but rather stern, don't you think? His wife says he keeps his letters filed by year. Imagine, all those letters. I should think it would be like living with a filing cabinet. Miss Marple placed a slice of cake on Miss Weatherby's plate. Some people, she said, keep letters as proof that something happened. And some keep them because they cannot bear to lose any part of their own story. Miss Weatherby chewed thoughtfully. Well, she said, I expect he has reasons. He always has reasons. He's a solicitor, after all. Miss Marple lifted her eyes slightly. Yes, she said, he does have reasons. Miss Weatherby continued. And Edith, she said, had been doing some work for him. Not his accounts, of course, but some committee thing. The village hall improvements. She was keeping the records. You know what she's like. She'd have every penny accounted for. Miss Marple's hand paused for a moment over the sugar bowl. The village hall accounts, she murmured. Yes, said Miss Weatherby. And now there's talk that the hall fund isn't as it ought to be. People are whispering it could be Edith's fault, which is monstrous, of course. But people will whisper anything if it gives them a shape to hold. Miss Marple's mouth tightened, just slightly. There are whispers, she said, that sound like wind through hedges. And there are whispers that sound like paper being torn. Miss Weatherby stared at her. What an odd thing to say, she said. Miss Marple smiled and rose to fetch the jam. Oh, I don't know, she said lightly. One hears so much. They spoke then of parsley and of the vicar's cough and of the price of coal. Miss Marple listened. She asked no direct questions. She did not say, "Tell me more about the ledger." She did not say, "What did Mr. Harrow do at the chalk pit?" She did not need to. Miss Weatherby, like most people, could not bear to leave a thought unfinished. The village, too, could not bear it. It would complete itself in conversation as surely as a child completed a rhyme. By the way, Miss Weatherby said at last, wiping her mouth carefully, do you know who found Edith's handbag? Miss Marple lifted the jam spoon. No, she said. In her shop, said Miss Weatherby. In the bottom drawer of the desk, under the receipt books. And that's not where she kept it. She always carried it, even in the shop. She used to say she didn't trust leaving money about, even if it was only a few shillings. Miss Marple put the jam spoon down. Her voice remained mild. That is strange, she said. A handbag is a very personal thing. Miss Weatherby nodded vigorously. Exactly, she said. And do you know what was in it? Everything. Her purse, her keys, even her little fountain pen, as if she'd put it away and said, that's that. But she wouldn't. She wouldn't ever. Miss Marple looked at the slice of cake on her own plate. She did not eat it at once. She seemed to be considering the crumbs. A person who puts away their handbag, she said softly, is usually preparing to stay. Not to go. Miss Weatherby frowned, as if trying to catch the meaning and finding it slippery. Well, she said, I expect Sergeant Dobbs will sort it all out. He has such a sensible way of looking at things. He said he'd have to examine all her correspondence. Imagine, all those letters. Miss Marple picked up her cup and drank. Yes, she thought. Imagine all those letters. And imagine, too, the one letter that mattered most, perhaps not even missing because it had never been there at all. Chapter 4. The post office keeper remembers a corner of paper. On Saturday morning, Miss Marple went to the chemist for a small jar of ointment that she did not strictly need but prefer to have in the house. It was one of her habits, to keep things properly laid in, because emergencies were never improved by having to send someone out. The chemist's assistant, a young man named Lionel Kemp, was behind the counter. He had a thin, earnest face and hair that refused to lie flat, as if it too had questions. Morning, Miss Marple, he said. How's your knee? Not troublesome today, Miss Marple said. Thank you, Lionel. As he wrapped the ointment, his eyes flickered towards the door and then back again, as though he wanted to speak but was unsure whether he was allowed. It's awful about Miss Cray, he said finally. Yes, said Miss Marple. It is. Lionel lowered his voice instinctively. I used to hear her sometimes, he said. Through the wall, I mean. Not that I was listening. The back rooms are close, you see. And she'd talk to herself a bit. Not much. Just little phrases when she was adding figures. Like someone keeping herself company. Miss Marple opened her purse with care. What phrases? She asked, and her tone was as casual as asking the price of a cabbage. Lionel frowned, tried to remember. She'd say, straight lines, straight mind, he said. That one. And sometimes, when she was cross, she'd say, no blotting over it. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the coins. No blotting over it, she repeated. Yes, said Lionel eagerly, pleased to have contributed something. Like you can't just smudge it and pretend it wasn't there. You have to write it properly. Miss Marple nodded. She paid and put the ointment in her basket. And did she say anything lately, she asked, that was different? Lunelis fastaitund. There was one morning, he said slowly, About 2 weeks ago, she came in for cough lozenges. She didn't usually. She'd sent a note with one of the children. But she came in herself, and she looked as if she hadn't slept. And she said, "It's strange, Lionel, how a person can write something that looks kind, and it isn't kind at all." Miss Marple looked at him. Her expression did not change much, but something in her attention sharpened, like a pencil being brought to a point. "And then," she said. Lionel shook his head helplessly. "That was all," he said. I laughed a bit because I didn't know what to say, and she smiled, but not properly. And then she said, "Never mind. It's only paper." Miss Marple thanked him and left. She did not walk straight home. She turned instead towards the post office again, because if there was paper involved, Mrs. Price would have seen it. Mrs. Price saw everything that traveled under stamp. The post office was quieter today. Only Mrs. Price stood behind the counter, sorting letters with quick, competent movements. Miss Marple asked for a small book of stamps and a postal order because it gave her time. Mrs. Price looked at her with that eager, restrained look of someone who had been waiting to speak to the right person. "Miss Marple," she said, "I was wondering when you'd come in." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "I expect you've been very busy," she said. "Such a fuss." Mrs. Price sniffed. "Yes, well," she said, "fuss indeed. But I keep thinking of something and I don't like it." Miss Marple placed her stamps carefully into her purse. "What is it?" she asked. Mrs. Price lowered her voice. "A letter," she said. "A letter that came from Miss Cray 3 weeks ago. Not one of the usual ones. Not bills, not committee notices. This was special." Miss Marple waited. She did not lean forward. She did not press. Mrs. Price continued, "Because silence is a kind of invitation." "It was heavy paper," she said. "Cream, not white. And the address was typed. Not her name. Miss E. Cray typed in neat little letters. And the stamp was, it was local but not posted here. It had one of those machine marks from the town." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And what was strange about it?" she asked. Mrs. Price frowned. "It was too proper," she said. "Too correct, if you know what I mean. Most people in the village write Edith or Miss Cray in their own hand. But this was like a business letter. And she held it in her hand for a long time before she put it in her bag." Miss Marple's voice was mild. She looked upset. Mrs. Price bit her lip. She looked like someone who'd been told off, she said, but politely. "That's what I can't bear. When someone is unkind in a way you can't point to." Miss Marple's eyes went to the stack of envelopes beside the scales. She saw, in her mind, the cream paper, the typed address, the stamp from town. "And did she say anything?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Price hesitated. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Price," as if I'd given her a gift, she said. And then she said, very quietly, "It is so thoughtful when people write, isn't it? It shows they have time." Miss Marple murmured agreement. But inside her mind something settled, like a seed finding its place in soil. A letter written to be thoughtful. A letter that showed someone had time. And a woman who kept accounts with straight lines, saying that kindness could be written in a way that was not kind at all. Miss Marple went home, and she rearranged the items in her basket. Parsley on top because it bruised, carrots beneath because they did not. And somewhere beneath those ordinary things, her mind began to keep a quiet account of paper. Cream, heavy, typed, too proper. Fear often hid itself behind good form. Chapter 5. The Girl with the Quick Mouth. It was in the early afternoon of the following Monday that Miss Marple received her significant piece of information, not from a careful older neighbor, but from someone younger, less guarded, and therefore more dangerous to herself. Daphne Harrow came to see her. Daphne was Rupert Harrow's niece, his sister's child, who had come to stay with him after a small disappointment in London that everyone spoke of with delicate vagueness. She was in her 20s, pretty in the way young women could be pretty without trying, and she carried herself with the restless impatience of someone who had not yet learned the usefulness of waiting. She arrived at Miss Marple's gate with a quick stride and an expression that suggested she had decided something and did not wish to be talked out of it. Miss Marple was in the front garden, checking the soil around the early tulips. She had a small trowel in her hand and earth on her gloves. "Miss Marple," Daphne called, as if one could call an elderly lady the way one called taxi. Miss Marple looked up. She did not show surprise. People arrived unexpectedly all the time when there was trouble. They were drawn to it like moths to a lamp. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple said. "Do come in. Mind the step." Daphne came through the gate without looking at the step. "I had to come," she said. "Uncle Rupert says I'm not to repeat things, and Aunt Celia says I'm to keep my mouth shut, and the whole house is like a sealed jar. I can't stand it." Miss Marple set down her trowel and brushed the soil from her gloves with small, careful movements. "A sealed jar," she said. "That can be wise sometimes. One keeps the jam from spoiling." Daphne made a small, impatient sound. "This isn't jam," she said. This is people being frightened, and no one will say it out loud, even about Miss Cray." Miss Marple led her into the sitting room, where the curtains were half drawn against glare and the chairs were arranged with quiet propriety. "Sit down," Miss Marple said. "You must have some tea." Daphne dropped into a chair as if it had offended her. "I don't want tea," she said. And then, because no one could resist Miss Marple's tea entirely, she added, "Well, perhaps a little." Miss Marple poured. Daphne washed her hands, and the watching seemed to calm her just slightly, as watching a competent person often did. "She's at Dr. Haydock's still," Daphne said suddenly. "Miss Cray. And Uncle Rupert went to see her yesterday." Miss Marple placed a biscuit plate on the table. "Did he?" she asked. Daphne nodded sharply. "He came back furious," she said. "Not furious with her. Furious in general. And he said, 'This is what comes of people keeping things they ought not keep.'" Miss Marple picked up her cup. "Keeping things," she repeated. "Yes," said Daphne. And then Aunt Celia said, "Rupert, please," in that awful way she has like she's smoothing a tablecloth over a stain. And Uncle Rupert said, "No, I will not have it. She has kept letters." Miss Marple's face remained composed. "Letters are often kept," she said mildly. Daphne leaned forward. "But he didn't mean love letters," she said. He meant something else. He said, letters are like receipts. They prove what was paid and what was owed. That's what he said." Miss Marple's eyes lowered to her own household account book on the side table. It lay closed, but she knew exactly what was written in it. Milk, bread, coal, the small regularities of a life carefully measured. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "They can be." Daphne's voice became quicker, as if once the words had begun they could not be stopped. "And I saw Miss Cray myself," she said, "before all this. I saw her with a letter. She was on her doorstep, early, about a fortnight ago. I was walking back from the village hall. I've been trying to help with the curtain committee." Miss Marple nodded, her expression patient. "And she was holding a letter," Daphne said. "Not open, just holding it like she didn't want it in the house. And she said to me, this is the odd part, she said, 'How very kind of him.'" Miss Marple did not react outwardly. "Kind of him," she repeated. "Yes," said Daphne. But her voice was wrong. Like she was reading from something. Like she was saying the words because she ought, not because she meant them. And then she said, "Oh, I remember exactly." She said, "I must answer at once." One must always answer at once when people take the trouble to be kind. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And does she look pleased?" Miss Marple asked. Daphne shook her head. "She looked as if she'd been slapped," she said, and then she flushed because it was an unladylike comparison. She looked upset, but she kept smiling, and then she said, "It is so easy to misread ink, isn't it?" And she laughed, and it was a dreadful laugh. Miss Marple's voice was very calm. "Yes," she said, "it can be." Daphne stared at her, frustrated by the calmness. "Don't you see?" she demanded. Something was happening. Something was happening to her before she went missing. And now Uncle Rupert is acting as if he's been wronged, and Aunt Celia is acting as if the curtains are more important than a woman nearly freezing to death, and everyone is tidy on the surface. Miss Marple smiled at the word. Tidy, she said. Daphne threw up her hands. Yes, tidy, like Miss Cray's shop, like they've wiped the table and put away the crumbs and expect us to believe nothing was eaten. Miss Marple's gaze lifted, just briefly, to Daphne's face. My dear, she said gently, you said a great deal. It must be tiring. Daphne's breath came out in a huff. I suppose, she said, and her bravado faltered. I suppose I shouldn't have come. Miss Marple reached for the biscuit tin. It is not wrong, she said, to notice when people's words do not match their faces. That is often how we keep ourselves safe. Daphne took a biscuit, suddenly looking younger. You don't think I'm being silly, she said. Miss Marple's voice was kind. No, she said. I think you are seeing something you do not yet know how to name. And then, as she always did when someone had given her what they did not know they were giving, Miss Marple moved the conversation gently away. Tell me about the village hall curtains, she said. What color have they chosen in the end? Something that won't show dust, I hope. Daphne blinked, thrown off balance, and began to talk about fabric samples. Miss Marple listened with polite interest, but inside her mind she held Daphne's words as carefully as she held her own preserves. How very kind of him. Answer at once. Misread ink. A letter held outside a house. A laugh that was dreadful. And Rupert Harrow speaking of letters like receipts. Miss Marple asked no direct questions. Yet the answers, as always, had come to her anyway. Chapter 6. Straight Lines and a Crooked Fear. That evening, Miss Marple took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote a short note to Dr. Haydock. Not a request, not an inquiry. Miss Marple did not ask to see patients as though they were curiosities, but a simple offer of help. Dear Dr. Haydock, she wrote, if Miss Cray should require any small personal items from her home or shop, I would be glad to fetch them. I imagine she may not wish a crowd of visitors. She folded it neatly, sealed it, and addressed it in her firm, legible hand. The next day, Dr. Haydock sent back a reply by hand, carried by one of the village boys. It was brief, written in the doctor's blunt scrawl. Dear Miss Marple, it read. Thank you. She has asked for her spectacles and a particular folder of papers from her desk. Sergeant Dobbs is aware. If you are willing, you may accompany him to identify the folder. Ush. Miss Marple read the note twice. She did not show satisfaction. Satisfaction would have been improper. But she felt, beneath her quiet exterior, that particular tightening of attention that came when the ordinary day took one, gently and without fuss, closer to the center of a thing. That afternoon she went with Sergeant Dobbs to Cray's shop. The shop was shut. A notice in the window, written in careful block letters, said, Closed temporarily due to illness. Thank you for your understanding. The notice looked as though it had been measured for straightness with a ruler. Sergeant Dobbs unlocked the door. The bell gave its usual polite jingle, and the sound, in the empty shop, was oddly cheerful. Miss Marple stepped inside. The smell was of paper and dust and a faint hint of boiled sweets. It was a smell that belonged to ordinary life. We're only here a moment, Sergeant Dobbs said, his tone respectful. She says there's a folder. Blue. Possibly labeled. Miss Marple nodded and followed him down the passage to the back office. The back office was exactly as Mrs. Price had said, everything in order. The desk surface held a blotter, a pen stand, a closed ledger, and a small framed photograph of Miss Cray's parents. The chair was pushed in. The first thing Miss Marple noticed was the absence of something. A small pile of used envelopes and odd scraps of paper that were usually kept in a tin for notes. Miss Cray had once said, in that restrained way she had, that she liked to keep every useful scrap. There was no tin. Sergeant Dobbs pulled on gloves. He opened the desk drawers carefully, one by one, as though each contained something fragile. Which folder? He asked. Miss Marple did not move at once. She stood, looking at the desk, as one might look at a garden bed and see where something had been planted and later removed. Then she reached, very gently, towards the blotter. "May I?" she asked. Sergeant Dobbs nodded. Miss Marple lifted the blotter. Underneath, on the wood, there was a faint rectangular mark, slightly lighter than the surrounding surface, where something had sat for a long time. "A tin," Miss Marple said quietly, almost to herself. Sergeant Dobbs glanced down. "A tin?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. She kept scraps, bits of paper, old envelopes, useful things. Sergeant Dobbs wrote it down without comment. He opened the top right drawer. It was locked. Sergeant Dobbs frowned. He tried again. "Locked," he said, surprised. "Key's not here." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "She always locked it," she said. "That was her private drawer." Sergeant Dobbs opened the bottom drawer instead. Inside were folders stacked upright like books. They were labeled in Miss Cray's neat hand. Village Hall, Parish Accounts, Harrow and Company, Personal. Sergeant Dobbs paused. "Harrow and Company," he murmured. Miss Marple did not respond. She did not need to. Sergeant Dobbs pulled out the blue folder labeled Personal. He opened it carefully. Inside were papers clipped together, receipts for coal, an insurance document, a letter from the electricity board, and then, tucked behind those, a small bundle of folded letters tied with a faded ribbon. Sergeant Dobbs looked at them. "These weren't mentioned," he said, and his voice had changed slightly. It had become more official, more guarded. Miss Marple's eyes went to the ribbon. It was the sort of ribbon one used to tie up old correspondence. Not pretty, practical. Sergeant Dobbs did not untie them in front of her. He placed the whole bundle back in the folder and closed it. "We'll take it," he said, "and show it to Dr. Haydock for her." Miss Marple nodded. As they turned to go, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the desk calendar, a small thing with daily tear-off pages. The page showing was Tuesday. It should have been, but the edge of Monday's page had been torn not straight across, but with a slight jag, as if someone had been impatient. Miss Cray, Miss Marple thought, tore things straight. She said nothing. They left the shop, locked it again, and walked back into the lane where the sun was lowering towards late afternoon. Sergeant Dobbs cleared his throat. "Miss Marple," he said, "you notice something back there? I can tell when you do." Miss Marple looked up at him with mild surprise, as though he had accused her of dancing. "Oh, Sergeant," she said, "one notices all sorts of little things. It's the way of villages." Sergeant Dobbs hesitated. "That bundle," he said. "Letters. You think it matters?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Letters always matter," she said. "They're the record people keep when they cannot say what they mean out loud." Sergeant Dobbs nodded slowly, as if filing her remark away like one of Miss Cray's ledgers. Miss Marple went home. She watered her plants. She checked her pantry shelves because it was nearly time to make marmalade. And all the while, the picture in her mind grew clearer. A locked drawer with its key missing, a tin removed from beneath a blotter, and a ribbon-tied bundle of letters labeled Personal. Not destroyed, not hidden away in a fireplace, but placed tidily behind receipts, as if someone had not known what else to do with them. Fear, she thought, did not always make a mess. Sometimes fear made things straight. Too straight. Chapter 7. The Hat Box in the Cupboard. The discovery of the hidden papers did not occur because Miss Marple hunted for them. It occurred because people, when frightened, began to tidy. Miss Cray's small cottage behind the shop had been left empty. The curtains were drawn. The garden, usually neat, had begun to look slightly uncertain, as gardens did when their keeper was absent, the path edges blurred, the small weeds daring to show their heads. Mrs. Tuck, who lived 2 doors down, took it upon herself to see to things, which in St. Mary Mead meant not only watering a plant, but also rearranging the entire moral furniture of the situation. She came one morning to Miss Marple's gate. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "Sergeant Dobbs is in Miss Cray's house, and he's asked if someone might come in while they go through her cupboards." "For decency, you know. He said you'd be suitable. Miss Marple set down the jar she had been drying. I expect Sergeant Dobbs is being very proper, she said. Yes, of course. She went with Mrs. Tuck to the cottage. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soap and of the particular dryness that belonged to unused rooms. Everything was tidy. Miss Cray's life had been arranged so that absence did not look like chaos. It looked like a pause. Sergeant Dobbs stood in the little sitting room with Constable Pritchard. A small table had been cleared, and on it were placed a few items: a handbag, a key ring, a small notebook, and the blue folder Miss Marple had seen. Thank you for coming, Sergeant Dobbs said. We're going to check her storage. Miss Cray may have, well, she may have things put away that relate to what happened. Miss Marple nodded. Mrs. Tuck hovered, eager as a cat near a pantry. They moved into the bedroom. Miss Cray's wardrobe stood open. Inside, her clothes were arranged by type and color. Her winter coats were brushed. Her shoes were lined up. On the top shelf sat a plain, cardboard hat box. Mrs. Tuck reached towards it once. Oh, I wonder, she began. Sergeant Dobbs held up a hand. Let's do it properly, he said, and he lifted the hat box down himself. Miss Marple stood slightly to one side, hands folded, eyes attentive. Sergeant Dobbs opened the hat box. Inside, beneath a neatly folded scarf, was not a hat but a smaller box, an old recipe box, metal, with a faded picture of strawberries on the lid. It looked like the sort of thing one might keep index cards in. Sergeant Dobbs frowned. He lifted it out and opened it. Inside were not recipes. Inside were letters, not tied with ribbon this time, bundled in groups with paper bands. Some envelopes were still present. Some letters were folded and refolded, the creases soft with handling. Constable Pritchard let out a small involuntary sound. Blimey, he murmured. Mrs. Tuck brought her hand to her mouth, as though she had found something indecent. Sergeant Dobbs lifted the top bundle. He read the first envelope. Dated February 14th, he said, and his brow furrowed. Last year. He looked at Miss Marple. These are personal, he said. Miss Marple's voice was mild, her eyes on the paper. They are records, she said. Personal records. Those are often the most important kind. Sergeant Dobbs unfolded one letter carefully, gloved fingers awkward on thin paper. He began to read aloud, not dramatically, but because he had to process it. Dear Miss Cray, it began. I am writing in the hope that you will accept this small reminder of our mutual obligations. It has come to my attention that certain private matters have been given undue attention in recent weeks. I am sure you will agree that it is always best for the peace of all concerned to refrain from unnecessary correspondence. Sergeant Dobbs paused. Miss Marple looked at the letter for a long time. The paper was cream, as Mrs. Price had described. The type was neat, but the margin on the left was slightly uneven, as if the typewriter carriage had not been set properly. Sergeant Dobbs read on. You have always conducted yourself with admirable discretion. I have no doubt you will continue to do so. It would be a pity if your reputation for correctness were to be misunderstood by those who do not comprehend the complexity of accounts. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the signature. It was type 2 art, Harrow. Sergeant Dobbs exhaled. Well, he said. Constable Pritchard stared. Mr. Harrow? He whispered, as if speaking the name might summon him. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She simply looked at the spacing, at the firmness of the typed letters, at the way certain words had been underlined with a pencil afterwards, as though Miss Cray had gone back over them. Then Miss Marple spoke, and her voice was as calm as if she were commenting on the quality of flour. This letter, she said softly, is written as if it is comforting, but it is not. Sergeant Dobbs turned to her, startled. How do you mean? He asked. Miss Marple's eyes remained on the paper. There is a kind of letter, she said, that tells you are safe and makes you feel unsafe. It uses phrases like peace of all concerned. It speaks of admirable discretion, and it reminds you of your reputation as though that reputation can be taken away. Sergeant Dobbs stared at her. then looked back at the letter. He opened another bundle. This one was handwritten. The handwriting was Miss Cray's. Miss Marple recognized it at once. Miss Cray's hand was neat, upright, careful. But here was different. There were crossings out, words squeezed into margins, lines written twice, as though she had not trusted the first. Sergeant Dobbs read the top line. Draft, not sent, it said, and then beneath. Mr. Harrow, it began, I have read your letter of February 14th. I am sure you will be relieved to know that I have no intention of causing unnecessary distress. However, you must understand that I cannot. The sentence stopped. It had been crossed out with hard strokes. Miss Marple spoke again, very quietly. That is fear, she said. Sergeant Dobbs looked at her sharply. Miss Marple added, almost apologetically, one sees it in how people press their pencil. They press as if pressing will hold the world steady. Sergeant Dobbs wrote something in his notebook. His pen moved quickly now. He went through the bundles without reading every letter aloud. But enough was clear. Letters from Rupert Harrow to Edith Cray, letters from Edith to Rupert, many unsent drafts, and then something else. Letters from a bank, marked overdue notice, and a small folded slip with figures on it, written in Rupert Harrow's hand. How did Miss Marple know it was his? Because Rupert Harrow wrote his T the way a man wrote who believed in crossing things firmly. The crossbar was heavy, decisive, placed slightly too high, as though he wished the letter to stand to attention. Miss Marple said only 2 more sentences. The first, he is frightened. Sergeant Dobbs looked up. The sort of frightened, Miss Marple said, that makes 1 tidy. Then she added, because it was true, and because it was the sort of remark that sounded like nothing, and yet was everything. Would anyone like more tea? Mrs. Tuck, perhaps you might put the kettle on. It will take some time to read what people have written. Sergeant Dobbs nodded slowly, as if grateful for the permission to be ordinary for a moment. And while Mrs. Tuck bustled off, scandalized and excited, Sergeant Dobbs's pen continued to move. Chapter 8. Marmalade and the Shape of Truth. At home the next day, Miss Marple made marmalade. It was a task that required attention, but not thought in the loud sense. One washed the oranges, sliced them thinly, boiled them slowly, watched the pot for the change in scent that meant the sugar was beginning to catch. Her hands were busy. Her kitchen smelled of citrus and steam. The jars stood ready, clean and warmed, like small waiting witnesses. And while she worked, her mind did what it always did when her hands were occupied. It laid out the facts as carefully as one laid out fruit slices, seeing how they fitted, where they overlapped, where the bitterness lay. Edith Cray, a private, orderly woman, a woman who kept accounts straight, who believed in not blotting over errors. A shop floor swept so clean there was no grit. A desk made too tidy, the kind of tidiness that did not belong to a person but to an intention. A missing tin of scraps under the blotter, the place where she kept odds and ends, the small pieces of paper that could be thrown away or saved. A locked drawer with its key removed. A hat box in the wardrobe holding letters disguised as recipes. And Rupert Harrow's typed words, mutual obligations, peace of all concerned, reputation for correctness. Fear had been written on cream paper and sealed with politeness. Miss Marple stirred the pot slowly. What had Rupert Harrow been frightened of? The village hall fund Miss Weatherby had mentioned. The whispers that the accounts were not as they ought to be. If Rupert Harrow had controlled those funds, if he had been the solicitor overseeing it, then Edith Cray's role as record keeper would have made her dangerous without any intention on her part. Not because she would accuse him, but because she would notice. And Rupert Harrow's life, by all accounts, was built on being noticed in the right way. A pillar, a committee man, a man with files by year, a man with a wife who smoothed tablecloths over stains. The marmalade thickened. Miss Marple watched the surface. Small bubbles rose and broke, the way truths rose when heated long enough. A frightened person sometimes did one dreadful thing and then spent years building a respectable wall around it, convincing themselves it was necessary. Every year added another layer. Every polite letter was another brick. Rupert Harrow had written to discourage Edith Cray, not to comfort her. He had reminded her of her reputation because he knew she valued it. He had spoken of misunderstood correctness, a threat disguised as a compliment. And then, when the letters did not achieve their purpose, when Edith Cray continued to keep records, continued to exist as a tidy, honest witness, he had needed to do something else. He had needed the letters, not to destroy them entirely, because destruction made noise, but to remove them from her possession, to take the scraps from her tin, the drafts, the small proofs that she had felt threatened, to take the key to the locked drawer, whatever was inside that drawer. So he had entered her shop. He had swept the floor too clean. He had washed her cup and put it upside down. He had placed her handbag where she would never have placed it because he thought a handbag belonged in a drawer, not in a woman's hand. Then he had lured her out. How? With a letter. A letter held outside the house. How very kind of him. Perhaps he had written something that sounded like kindness and carried, beneath it, an instruction, a meeting, a request, an appeal to duty, to discretion, to peace. Edith Cray, raised on the belief that one answered letters promptly, would go. She would go because she did not know how not to go. She would go because her life was built on correct responses. And at the chalk pit hut, on Rupert Harrow's land, something happened. Not a melodramatic struggle. Rupert Harrow was not wicked in the way novels liked. He was frightened. And frightened people sometimes do harm with a strange carefulness, as if carefulness will absolve them. He had put her there. He had left her, perhaps intending only to frighten her into silence, intending to retrieve what he needed and then let her be found. Or perhaps he had intended something worse and had lost his nerve. Either way, she had survived. But survival, when it comes after cold and confinement and fear, did not always bring clarity. Sometimes it brought confusion. Sometimes the mind protected itself by refusing to remember the exact moment the world broke. Miss Marple lifted a spoonful of marmalade and watched how it fell. Thick now. The truth, too, had thickened. And the most painful part, the part that made Miss Marple's eyes soften, was this. Edith Cray had been harmed not because she was curious, not because she meddled, but because she kept records properly. She had done nothing but live as she was, orderly, careful, exact. And someone had taken that order and used it as a mask. Miss Marple filled the jars and sealed them. The lids clicked as they cooled, that small domestic sound of completion. When she wiped her hands and looked out of the window, she knew what she would do next. Not investigate, not accuse, but make, as she had made marmalade, a small further observation, delivered at the right moment, in the right room, so that others could see what had been in front of them all along. Chapter 9. A small further observation. The police had borrowed the back room of the village hall as their temporary workspace. It was not dramatic. It smelled faintly of floor polish and last week's chrysanthemums. There were 2 tables pushed together, papers stacked, a kettle in the corner, and a plate of slightly stale biscuits that someone had provided in the belief that official work required refreshments. Miss Marple arrived in the late morning, wearing her best coat and carrying her handbag with quiet dignity. Sergeant Dobbs looked up as she entered. His expression was wary but respectful, like a man who had once underestimated a small dog and did not intend to repeat the mistake. "Miss Marple," he said, "what can we do for you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, nothing much," she said. "I only thought—" "Well, I thought I had a small further observation. If you have a moment." Sergeant Dobbs gestured to a chair. "Of course," he said. "Please sit down." Miss Marple sat. She placed her handbag on her lap and folded her hands on top of it. She did not begin with Rupert Harrow. She did not begin with letters. She began, as she always did, with the person at the center. "Poor Miss Cray," she said softly. "It must be very dreadful for her. She has always lived by correctness, by doing things properly. Sergeant Dobbs nodded, his face tightening. She's still very confused, he said. Dr. Haydock says she comes and goes. Sometimes she remembers her childhood. Sometimes she can't recall yesterday. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. Yes, she said. The mind keeps its accounts in curious ways. When a shock comes, it sometimes misfiles. Sergeant Dobbs shifted slightly, as if uncomfortable with tenderness. We have to work with what we can prove, he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she said. Of course you do. And proof is usually paper. Sergeant Dobbs watched her carefully now. Miss Marple continued in the same mild tone. You have read Mr. Harrow's letters to her, she said. The typed ones. Sergeant Dobbs nodded. We have, he said. Miss Marple tilted her head. Did you notice, she said, how he addressed her? Sergeant Dobbs frowned. Dear Miss Cray, he said. Sometimes dear Missy Cray. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. Very proper. Sergeant Dobbs's eyes narrowed. You think that's significant? Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. Mr. Harrow has known her for years, she said. He sits on committees with her. He has spoken to her in the village. It is unusual, in a small place, to keep such distance in writing unless one is trying to make the letter feel official, as though it belongs to rules rather than to feelings. Sergeant Dobbs picked up a pen, then set it down again. That could be his style, he said cautiously. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. It could, but then there is the paper itself. Sergeant Dobbs leaned forward slightly. The cream paper, he asked. Miss Marple nodded. It is the sort of stationery, she said, that is chosen to look expensive without being flamboyant. Respectable. He wishes to be seen as respectable. That is not a crime, of course. Sergeant Dobbs's mouth tightened. No, he said. It isn't. Miss Marple went on. And then there is the type, she said. I used to type long ago. Not well, but enough to know that each machine has its own small habits. A letter slightly out of alignment. A certain E that sits lower than it should. A pressure that is a little heavier on one side. Sergeant Dobbs stared at her. We've had someone look at it, he said slowly. There's a consistent misalignment, yes. Miss Marple nodded, as if confirming the weather. It reminds me, she said, of the notices for the Village Hall Committee. The ones Mr. Harrow types. If you place them side by side, well, one might see a family resemblance. Sergeant Dobbs's eyes flicked away, then back. We did compare, he admitted, and his voice had shifted. We did. Miss Marple reached for a biscuit delicately, as if to soften the sharpness of what she was saying. And then, she said, there is Miss Cray's fear. Sergeant Dobbs's brow furrowed. Fear? Miss Marple nodded, biscuit untouched in her fingers. Her drafts, she said. The one she did not send. They're crossed out. Pressed hard. She wrote as if she were trying to make herself sound calm. That is what women often do when they are frightened. They try to sound calm so that no one can accuse them of being hysterical. Sergeant Dobbs looked down at the papers on his table. Miss Marple, he said, are you suggesting Mr. Harrow threatened her? Miss Marple looked at him mildly. Oh, Sergeant, she said, I'm not suggesting anything. I only say that a letter can be written to discourage and still appear kind. Miss Cray herself said something of the sort, I believe, to the chemist assistant. Sergeant Dobbs's eyes widened slightly. You heard that? He asked. Miss Marple smiled. One hears things, she said simply. She set the biscuit down and folded her hands again. And there is one more thing, she said, about the order in her shop. Sergeant Dobbs's pen moved now quickly. Yes, he said. Miss Marple's voice was soft. When someone makes a room tidy who does not live in it, she said, they tidy in a general way. They tidy how they believe a tidy room should look. But they do not tidy in the personal way. They do not know where the little tin of scraps is kept. And if they find it, they do not know whether it matters. They do not know which page of the calendar should be torn straight, and which cannot be torn at all without discomfort. They do not know the habits. Sergeant Dobbs's face tightened with concentration. You're saying it was staged, he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I am saying, she replied, that Miss Cray's order was a lived order. And what you found was, if you will forgive me, a performed one. There was a silence in the room, thick as marmalade. Sergeant Dobbs looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as though something had settled into place without any need for announcement. Thank you, Miss Marple, he said, and his voice was very respectful now. That's very helpful. Miss Marple picked up her handbag. Oh, she said, rising. I am glad. Do have another biscuit, Sergeant. You look as though you've been living on tea. Sergeant Dobbs gave a brief, humorless smile. We have, he said. Miss Marple left the village hall and walked home at her usual pace. Behind her, Sergeant Dobbs's pen continued to move. And in the village, without anyone having to shout it, the quiet account of Rupert Harrow began to change, one small entry at a time. Chapter 10. When the accounts are read. The resolution did not arrive like a trumpet. It arrived the way official things arrived in England, in letters, in visits, in quiet conversations held behind doors that closed firmly. Rupert Harrow was not arrested dramatically in the village square. There were no handcuffs displayed for the benefit of passers-by. There was, instead, an interview in town. There were questions asked by men in plain clothes. There were papers requested from banks and committees. There was a slow unpicking of funds and dates and signatures, like unpicking a seam to see where the fabric had been forced. And as the official channels did their work, Rupert Harrow's reputation began its quiet unraveling. People noticed small changes first. Mrs. Weatherby remarked that Mrs. Harrow, Celia, had stopped coming to the market. Mrs. Bantry mentioned that the Harrow car was gone for long stretches of the day. Mrs. Price said that letters addressed to Harrow and Company had begun to arrive with unfamiliar stamps from auditors and solicitors and places with names that sounded heavy. No one said at once, Mr. Harrow has done wrong. The village did not like direct statements until it had exhausted every softer alternative. But people began to say instead, it's a pity. And one never knows, do one? And he always seems so proper. Miss Marple heard these remarks without satisfaction. Frightened people, she thought, could do dreadful harm. But frightened people were not always monsters. Often they were ordinary men who had once made a small error and then, rather than write it down plainly and correct it, had blotted over it, and over it, and over it, until the page tore. 2 weeks after Miss Marple's visit to the village hall, Dr. Haydock sent her another note. She's stronger, it read. She would like to see you. Ush. Miss Marple went at once, taking with her a small jar of marmalade and a bunch of early daffodils. Miss Cray lay in the spare bedroom at Dr. Haydock's house. She looked smaller than Miss Marple remembered, as though the shock had reduced her, but her eyes were clear today. When Miss Marple entered, Miss Cray's gaze fixed on her with a kind of careful relief. Miss Marple, she said, and her voice was hoarse but precise. Thank you for coming. Miss Marple sat beside the bed and placed the daffodils in a small vase. They're early, she said, but cheerful. Miss Cray's hands lay on the blanket. Her fingers were thin, and Miss Marple noticed, with quiet understanding, that the nails were short and clean. The nails of someone who did not like dirt under them, who kept herself in order. I remember, Miss Cray said slowly, some things. Not all, but some. Miss Marple nodded. That is often how it comes back, she said gently, like reading a page that was smudged. The words appear one at a time. Miss Cray swallowed. I thought, she said, if I answered properly, it would stop. That if I wrote the right words, politely, it would stop. Miss Marple's eyes were kind. Yes, she said softly. One thinks that sometimes, especially women who have lived by correctness. Miss Cray's mouth tightened. He was frightened, she said, and there was a strange mix of anger and pity in her voice. And he made me frightened, as if his fear had to be shared. Miss Marple did not contradict her. Fear, she knew, was contagious. Miss Cray stared at the ceiling for a moment. I kept the letters, she said. Not because I wanted trouble, but because I knew I was being made to doubt myself. When someone writes kindly and means harm, you begin to wonder if you are imagining it. So I kept them to remind myself that I was not. Miss Marple reached out and touched Miss Cray's hand lightly. That was wise, she said. Miss Cray turned her head and looked at her. I didn't feel wise, she said. I felt small and ashamed. And then, when he asked me to meet him, when he wrote as if it was a favor, she stopped. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Miss Cray was not a woman who spilled. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You do not have to tell me, she said. Miss Cray's fingers tightened on the blanket. I thought, she whispered, that if I kept the account straight, no one could hurt me. That is ridiculous, isn't it? Miss Marple shook her head. No, she said. It is not ridiculous. It is simply incomplete. Miss Cray's gaze sharpened slightly. Incomplete? Miss Marple looked at the small table beside the bed, where Dr. Haydock had placed a jug of water and a notebook for observations. Accounts, Miss Marple said quietly, are only as safe as the person reading them. If the reader wishes to misread, if the reader wishes to blot, then the figures can be used as weapons. Miss Cray's eyes closed briefly, as if from pain. I wanted to be correct, she said. I wanted to be beyond reproach. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Yes, she said, and that is exactly what he used. She sat for a little while longer, speaking of small things, the daffodils, the marmalade, the way the weather was turning. When she rose to leave, Miss Cray's hand tightened around hers for a moment. Thank you, Miss Cray said, and her voice was steadier now. For seeing, without making a fuss. Miss Marple smiled. It is easier, she said, to see when one is quiet. Outside, the village lay under a pale sun. The church clock struck the hour with its usual calm insistence, as if time itself kept the most honest accounts. Miss Marple walked home. She paused by her garden gate and looked at the small beds where the first shoots were coming up. Gardens, she thought, were like records. If you kept them carefully, you could tell what had been planted, what had failed, what had been dug up, what had been covered over. But sooner or later, always what was buried did something. It either rotted and poisoned the soil, or it pushed its way up, quietly, into light. And justice, when it came, did not always come with noise. Sometimes it came like a ledger opened at last, the figures read properly, the false entries seen for what they were. Secrets buried deep, justice running deeper still.